Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to your favorite 3M channel. And I have pleasure to welcome back Chase and Josh, my two wonderful dear friends and brothers. I called them. I nicknamed them in the last episode as Burgundy Brothers, and even though they're not Burgundy tonight, I would still like to stay with that nickname if they don't mind because it's so unique and cute. But yeah,
Well, we're yin yang style now, so
Yeah.
with the black and
yes,
white.
yeah,
Nice shirt, by
gentlemen.
the way.
Oh,
Yes,
me?
Yeah, you. I like
Oh,
that.
thank you. Thank
It's
you very
nice merch,
much.
bro.
Yeah, yeah. It's brand new. It fits me really well too. I really like it. So, anyways,
yes. But yes, welcome back. Thank you for finding time for the channel and for our viewers. I thank you in my name and in their name. And tonight we'll be continuing talking about the topic which we started last time. That will be reading and writing fiction as a Christian from Christian perspective. Last time we left about talking about, do you guys find support in your church regarding the work you're doing, Chase, with you as a fantasy author, and for you, Josh, as someone who is having two YouTube different channels and also using storytelling as a gift in order to reach people. So tonight we'll be continuing in the same manner, but just with another subtopic. I would like to start with you, Chase. If you can please tell us, when it comes to your storytelling and world building, how do you build your imaginary world, the setting, and everything as a fantasy author, as a creator?
yeah. So, boy, where to start? I I get a lot of kind of like we were talking about last time. I get a lot of influence in terms of like world building from our our actual world. So I take a lot of things that we have that you see in our world, and I'll just in a certain like in conceptually or at least or in terms of a concept, I'll just kind of translate that over into my world that I'm building. So different kinds of government systems and religions and stuff like that. There's sort of I have a sort of a representation ish of like Islam, and then I have something for high church uh, uh, perspectives, like the Roman Catholic concepts, and then the Eastern Orthodox concepts. Sort of, kind of. I mean, I kind of put them together. I don't want to get too complicated. So, but then I have just sort of the concepts for like Protestant ideas and stuff like that. A little bit more, but there's a little bit more focus on like individualism stuff, things like that. So those are some areas, but even culture wise, I take concepts from different cultures in our actual world, and I just sort of translate them over to the fantasy world. So sometimes I just kind of attribute like the elves in my story to the Jews of sort of the ancient world. They're kind of like the chosen people of God in the Old Testament, and they sort of fall away, and they sort of fail to uphold the covenant they made with God. Taking like a lot of biblical parallels and then translating them over into the fantasy story. Another one of the things too that I didn't mention last time, because I don't want to get too much into the weeds about it, but in my world, I don't really have different kinds of like races, like the elvish race and the human race and the dwarvish race. They're all basically human. They're all one human race, but they're just sort of different ethnic or individual types of groups of that human race. And that comes from my belief that we were all made in the image of God. And I believe, and I have every single one of these particular ethnic groups, the elves, the humans, which I call the humans basically the Aeon men. That's just what I named them. But so they're those. I have them. I have the dwarves, and I have sort of the cat-like people who I call the Comorgians. They're all made in the image of God, basically, essentially, and that just reflects my belief that the gospel there's one gospel for all. There's not one gospel for these people, one gospel for these people. Blah, 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 blah. There's like one redemption for everybody. I felt like if I had different, not simply just different ethnic or different kinds of humans, but if I had just humans and then a different race altogether, I felt like, how am I going to really fit a gospel message in there? It's gonna if I feel like I might struggle with that a little bit. So But even in scripture as well, I have I have sort of in my story the holy scriptures in a story as well that are given from divine inspiration to the world. So those are certain things like that. So what I do is I just take a lot of things that are existing in our world and I kind of translate them over, but I try not to make it too obvious at the same time, not too wide out in the open. It's just like these subtle little things. Because what I want to do is I want people to, especially people who don't agree with me on everything, like you probably see over there. Uh, but I want to take a lot of that. Like I want to, I don't want to preach at people, like you see in a lot of stuff today. I want to be like, here's, if I can get my message in the story, in a well-rounded story, in a subtle way. Maybe you see it like you may not agree with me, but now you might see it from a different perspective and see things from a different perspective and maybe go, oh, I never thought about it that way before, something so basically like that. But also in terms of the world building history, I use a lot of history to, like for example, what we one of the things you see that happens in history all the time. This is one of the reasons why there's so many different kinds of nations, is because a lot of times, like with Charlemagne, he's just this great king. He just unites all of these um, people in Europe, basically. Well, I mean, he has his way of doing it, of course, but unites, brings them all together, basically. But of course, he dies, and then his kingdom is split between his sons, and then that just starts off all that stuff. But it happens even before that with like Alexander the Great. He's takes conquering all the Mediterranean, stuff like that, and then he dies, and then his empire basically splits, and it just happens constantly. So I take things like that. So you'll have this one great character in my story, this one great character who just has like Charlemagne's gift of just being like that guy was just, he has his good and his bad, but he was just meant to be who he was, that the kind of guy he was. But his sons maybe not, maybe not as good as him. But I have the same kind of stuff in my stories where I have certain leaders who just have this power, this ability to just lead and unite entire nations, but they die eventually, and those eventually crumble and fall apart, and they split off into creating all these different little nations and stuff like that. So I do a lot of that kind of stuff. It's just I take a lot of history that I've learned, and I just go, that'd be kind of a neat concept to put in my story. Like I get a lot of my ideas from that. And then of course the when I build the maps and stuff like that, I create little maps and stuff of the regions and whatnot. I did a lot of research into like geography, and I wanted to make a world that felt very real, not the same as ours, but felt very real. Like desert areas would be desert areas because of the geography, and then like lush areas would be lush areas because of the geography, tundras and so on and so on and so forth. At the same time, I also wanted to make sure that I was being very careful, because it's, even though I want there to be a lot of realism, I think if you go too far into the realism, you kind of just, the fantasy aspect just kind of ends up going out the window. So I'm trying to like balance it out between a lot of realistic concepts and then a lot of fantasy aspects in both creating the physical world and then just the lore of the world, things like that. So that's just kind of basically the main rundown of how I go about making my world. Other than that, it's just, the only thing I tell people is just, it just happens, I just kind of, I get an idea and I put it down, and it leads me on to another idea and another idea. And it just kind of, it's like a little thing that just kind of just starts to go out, like that, it just starts to do it, so, but that's just sort of my thinking about how I build everything, and everything that I put together in the world, and the lore, and all the stories, all the nations in the story and stuff, and their backgrounds, all the races and their backgrounds and stuff. That's kind of how I do it all.
Yeah, cool. Before I ask if Josh wants to contribute to this, I remember when I was learning in one of the classes that Charlemagne was the first official European. That's how he was known and called, the first European. Um, from what I'm understanding, how you're writing the narratives or maybe even dialogues, because you said you don't want to sound too preachy. So I think you're applying what most authors would say in general: show, don't tell.
Hmm.
And I don't always know how to do that, but that's commendable. I'm glad you're doing that way. I was just curious. Do you have any magic system in your writings?
Yeah, I'm developing it. It's still kind of developing. I'm developing it as I write. I base it off a lot of. I do get a lot of inspiration from like the Last Airbender stuff, but at the same time, I also try to draw influences from the Elder Scrolls. Things like that. I draw a little bit of influence from that. So yeah, I can't go into to all the details of it right now, but like I drew a lot of influence from the Elder Scrolls in the sense of like there, especially in the Skyrim series, which I played a ton of when I was younger. Where like there's like these different categories of magic. There's like illusion magic, there's restoration magic, and elemental magic. I kind of took a little bit of that idea, and so there's different categories of magic in my world stuff, and so a lot of it, a lot of the ability for a master, which is a magic capable person in the story, but for a lot of the ability of a master to win a fight depends on their strategy in using the elements and their ability to use magic to their advantage, stuff like that. And each character kind of has their preferences, like everybody in my story, unlike in the Avatar series where there's only one, like a firebender, he can't do any other bending, he's just firebending. But in this one, you can do all of them basically, but some of them still, most masters are just, they like to use fire more often. It's just kind of part of who they are. Some of them like to just use rock or ground more. I can't say earth because it's not actually earth. So, but like, and then air and water and stuff like that. It just depends on which one they kind of like, that they tend to go towards and things like that. So, but yeah, it's a magic system. I again at the same time trying to balance between hard magic system and a soft magic system. I'm not trying to be too technical with it, but technical enough. And there's also a bit of a science behind it. So in the magic in my world, I'll tell you this real quick. There are these structures throughout the world. They're mysterious structures, and they're just known as the temples, and they're scattered about the world. And these structures, they're like made of a certain kind of mysterious alloy that is like indestructible. No one can tear it apart. No one can break it down. No one knows exactly where they came from, and there's a whole legend behind them. But these structures, the metallic alloy radiates the magic energy that's used throughout the world, and that magic energy is like carried across landscapes through like wind and stuff like that. So in the story, I do kind of take a little bit of the concept of like the Total War, not the Total War, the Warhammer series of like the Winds of Magic kind of stuff like that. So there's actually some of that in my story as well. And so a master can use the Winds of Magic to their ability, to their advantage if they want to. But the magic is a certain form of like radiation, basically. That's like all in the air, but only a master has the ability to tap into it and use it to their advantage and use it to whatever they want to use it for and stuff. So that's kind of the general idea of like what I've been building and working on developing. So
Cool, thanks. Josh, when you're leading your two YouTube channels, as well as ministering to people in person through preaching, telling stories, giving illustrations. How do you feel in all of this work of ministry, which is also creative work? How do you feel you're mimicking God by being creative?
Um, in the most direct sense, I feel like it is only that I can mimic God, because my creativity relies on me having something from before me in order to make something after me. I'm completely reliant in a way that God isn't. So I can't really create like God, but God gave me the ability. It's kind of like I believe it was more so about the idea of goodness or morality, but C.S. Lewis talked about the idea of God giving us a thimble full of himself. Just the time, just enough that we can, out of the inexhaustible ocean of God's goodness, he gave us a thimble full of his goodness. And in some certain sense, I feel like he did the same thing with things like with things like the ability to perceive and create things beautiful, right? Because not if you look at the modern world around us, especially in like America or in developing countries that are around the world, the architecture is made for function, and we've almost said form is for the rich. It's something that we don't need anymore, and it's like the beauty of things is something that we didn't realize when we started omitting it, that was such a driving force in human fulfillment and our unities around things and the purpose and function of things, not just like a building to be tall and house as many people as possible, right? But a building used to, be let's say you would have your own homes in your own kind of idiosyncratic ways, in the way that we each have our own story, let's say, and there's all these separations, but there was something that unified them as well. It was the way that the town square was built, that everyone came, all those roads led to that same place. Now all of our roads are all disparate, our communities are completely broken up. What we that this is These are the kind of things that I feel like when we use our creativity in the way that it seems to have been designed, it ends up being an element or a tool of relation and unity, as well as something that can be enjoyed, or a hobby or something like that. And so I think when we mimic God in our creativity, in the ways that we do that, those ways are often, let's say, should be bound up also in the kind of rituals that can bring us unity, right? Like, we have dinner tables. If we made our dinner tables into, let's say, a stack of 4 crates and a plank of wood, right? It would still serve the same function, right? But it doesn't bring the same feeling or aesthetic that we all know when you see a table that is beautiful, with beautiful chairs, and it's set and it's got candles and there's a tablecloth. There's something that brings about this beauty, and that beauty gives you a feeling of belonging and comfort sometimes. And it's like the way that we build our stories, or the way that we build our analogies, like the ones that I'm using now. Those are the kind of things that, when we use those things, like Chase was just talking about, I like this game, I like this idea, I like this part of history. I'm gathering and mining these pieces together that are helping to inform the way that I look at the world, right? And then I'm using that to try to infiltrate somebody else's way of looking at the world, but not in a negative sense. Like that creativity is something that can, like I said, bind us together rather than separate us. And so for me, mimicking God is something that can allow us to to come together, in a very real way. We Because it's like we're doing now. The three of us together on this podcast are all gathered together here, even in this digital space, to talk about this one thing that we're all passionate about. We get to share this passion that informs the way that we look at the world. And so those things, including creativity, aren't extras that should be shoved onto the side. They're things that are actually central to things like our human fulfillment in our living. I think that those are things that we're really privileged to be able to have.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Before I ask you this question, both of you, it's a short, easy question, but I'm still confused about it. I want to say, Chase, I wanted to encourage you writing in the way you're writing, because even though you're using sometimes secular works of fiction, like video games in this example, um, and this has to do with some stuff we mentioned in the previous episode. It doesn't matter if some works of art or beauty or fiction are coming from secular authors, they can still be inspired in some way to represent the truth and to, give some good spiritual and solid biblical messages. And from you borrowing something from Skyrim or Warhammer, adapting your own way, using to point to Christ, there may be some skeptic who one day will buy or open your book and read it and find similarities in what he or she's used to in this example video games, but they can see how you have advanced certain theme or idea or plot, and how in your case it leads to this supreme most high being which we call God. So I just wanted to, encourage you to continue doing what you're doing, because I can get this mug, it doesn't matter who made it, I can still use it to be glorified for, glorifying God's name and spreading his kingdom. So good job. The question that is puzzling to me, and it's a short simple question for both of you: how come so many Christians do not see beauty in the work of fantasy? Especially because God is the one who created beauty, who gave us creativity. And again, he also blesses and gives skills and gifts even to secular people who don't care about him. But they still use these gifts to write something beautiful. So, how come so many Christians don't see beauty in these works of fiction, be it fantasy or cyberpunk? Doesn't matter what, like science fiction, whatever. Why are we so blind?
Well, it's kind. I think a lot of the answer is kind of like what I was saying yesterday or the last program is that um, there's 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 a sense of like I like to call it hypersensationism, but maybe that's not the best term for it. But it's this idea that it's just like there's this fear. I think like I remember my sister. She knew this lady. My sister loves little fairies and stuff. And there was this lady in our church years ago. She's not at our church anymore, who turned out to be like a King James onlyist kind of lady and stuff, you know. But the lady told my sister that fairies were like satanic and stuff like that, you know. And I was like, what? You know, like I was a baby Christian back then, but I was like, I'm pretty sure there's nothing about that, and sure, like this says that, you know, like but you know, there's like little, honestly, like little Tinkerbell fairies. Basically, that's what my sister would have. And so, but there's just like this. There's a superstition in a lot of Christianity, and again, it's a lot of it is in that sort of fundamentalist little bubble. You know, just our my way or the highway, stuff like kind of stuff like that. People who just don't care about what other people think about anything. You know, and you don't necessarily have to agree with everybody, you know, but at least understand why they think the way they do, and that maybe not everything that they believe is satanic and stuff like that. But it's this phobia of, and that's why one of the reasons that's one that character I mentioned in the last program, that Bastelina, that pastor or whoever, he's kind of like that. He's just this kind of character that's just like, you know, it's you stay here, you don't go anywhere else, you stay right here, kind of stuff like that. Like his little control of his little group of people. But it is that idea that I think hampers or ruins creativity. It doesn't trust that all of these things, the creativity and the fact that there are so many of these fantasy worlds that are built are just implicit of the image of God in even secular people. Like they can't help but do it themselves. You know, it's that creativity, because God is the great creator. And we are made in his image. We therefore have that creative aspect within us that's unique to us. And we should take full advantage of that. God wants us to use that. I think that's just very clear. So there's just so for me, I think a lot of it is just this phobia and this fear of doing anything but just you know, preaching Bible, preaching Bible, preaching Bible. Again, I'm all for that. Believe me, I'm all for that. Don't get me wrong. But there are, God doesn't just say, I don't think God just wants us to just do just that, but to take our creative abilities and preach the gospel through art, through creating stories and things like that. You know, and God will use those things. God has used those things. I know people who like don't like C.S. Lewis and whatever, and they say, you know, you can't be a real reformed guy if you like C.S. Lewis. And I'm like, I don't care what you guys think. Honestly, if I'm in consistent area, I'm fine with it. I like reading C.S. Lewis, so you know, whatever. I don't care. I learn a lot from C.S. Lewis, and so I just take the things I agree with him, and I embrace those things I don't agree with. You know, that's it. You know, so we shouldn't be afraid of those things. We shouldn't be afraid to just you know, try to understand where someone else is coming from. And so I think that's where a lot of it comes from. It's just this sort of what I just call this hyper cessationism, where it's just, you know, you just preach the Bible. That's it. You don't get creative. You don't come up with stories, yeah, anything like that. You know, I think that's, for me, at least, that's my answer to the question.
I think it's interesting because when I was listening to you ask the question specifically, I wasn't really thinking about uh, just the idea of why people would actively think that it was evil necessarily, in the way that asking why somebody doesn't see beauty in it. Especially like, because we often, I think what happens, especially in our modern time right now, we've had so much of a an idea that we need to be cheerleaders for ourselves, that we tell ourselves things that probably aren't exactly true, but are useful enough to motivate you in a moment, right? Not everybody is creative. In fact, most people aren't, even at all. It's very difficult to be genuinely creative. And so I think that's why it is that, you know, let's say 1% of writers probably have 90% of the success. You know, like that kind of distribution happens in most everything that is a creative thing to do, right? And so not everybody has the intuition or the forte to be creative in that way. So that, I think that's why a lot of Christians don't do writing and don't do those kind of things, aren't engaging in making the, you know, the arts, and maybe aren't musicians or, you know, whatever. I think the reason why that's rare is because just naturally it's rare, which is why I think we have a higher admiration for it, because it is rare. You know, beauty is something that is for some reason frivolously everywhere in God's creation, and yet beauty that's made by humans isn't the same thing. Like it's kind of sparse. Only some people know how to make things beautiful. Only some people are more especially beautiful, right? Like beauty for humanity seems to be something that is sought out as a virtue, even though we kind of have it on the house in creation in God's work, because He's the greatest creator, right? And so I think we take for granted that beauty's everywhere, and God is so creative that it just looks like the universe is a place that just breeds creativity, you know. But it's actually very difficult to be a genuinely creative, you know. And I think that a lot of people, especially in the modern mindset, lack the creative intuition because we were shamed out of creativity as children because of the way that we're taught to think about the idea of truth and fact as the same thing, rather than thinking about fact as something that is just plain itself. There's no aboutness to it, right? Like I can just say a square has four sides. Like that's true, but it's just a fact, right? Where if I said we need Christ like a tree needs water, right? Like I'm just making a similitude. It's not technically true. Like Christians aren't any more biologically alive than people who aren't Christians. So obviously it's not the same thing, right? But it's true. We know that it's true, even though it doesn't fall into the category of fact. It's like what we've been sold a bill of goods, I think, by the modern world, into thinking that if something's not cold hard facts or established by cold wisdom or excuse me, philosophical logic, let's say, rather than a living, experienced wisdom. Uh, Logic is great and it has its place, and we should be logical to the degree that it is healthy and ordinate and useful. But humans, let's be honest, are not perfectly logical creatures, and that's why many people are unhappy in a world in which only logic can reign. We need things like stories and fantasy, but not everybody's awakened. They don't have their imagination is not enchanted right now, because it's been told to them that they experience that enchantment as a negative, because they've been shamed out of it. We've really been shamed out of being imaginative. We've been told to stop being childish, and we forgot to be childlike, right? There's something that we desperately desire that we're neglecting to allow for ourselves because we've been shamed out of it because of modern thinking, I think.
You know, I was, that really makes me, real quick here, just to like, I'm reminded again of the abolition of man. It's fascinating. C.S. Lewis, again, he begins it with criticizing a book that's ultimate, that will ultimately ruin the imagination of children. um, I think that's one of the reasons. Like that's the reason why we're kind of in a rut right now. Is the imagination has been darkened, and so you see a lot of what we see in media today. It's not very creative, not very interesting. I haven't watched. Can't remember the last movie I watched that blew me away. I really can't. It's been a while. Um, so I think um, we want people to be logical. We want people to be rational. We want people to think. But in many ways, a lot of that a lot of that begins with the imagination in many ways, and that's why another reason, one of the reasons why I think storytelling right now is really important. A really good storytelling to awaken the imaginations, to lighten up darkened. That just kind of reminded me of that.
And also, just to add for a moment, also is that being creative is not just for fun. It's also has a deep utility. And the way that we write stories, the way that we build stories, the way we be, he's Chase just went through a beautiful explanation of all of the drastic experience and influence that's necessary to be compiled before you can make something like a world just for your narrative to inhabit. And so it's like when a story becomes something that is repeated throughout history, like the fairy tales and fables and beautiful stories of cautionary tales and wonder and happily ever after that have seriously survived human history. The reason they survived is because nothing in them is there by accident. You know what I mean? And yet it all happened in some crazy, really lengthy, almost arbitrary seeming process. And yet nothing is there on accident. Nothing that is left in those stories permanently is on accident, you know? And it's like when people learned those stories, it wasn't just because they were asking mom to tell them something fun. A lot of the older stories are actually rather terrifying if you think about it. Like Hansel and Gretel, that's a children's story. Is it? It's actually terrifying. Like, okay, kids, you're gonna go into the woods, and then you're gonna find a house that's way too good to be true, and inside it is something that's gonna eat you alive. That's pretty terrifying, right? But guess what? It teaches the children to use their imagination to think ahead, to make little avatars of themselves in their heads, and to play out scenarios to see which ones will fail and which ones won't. And you can act out the ones that win. You need these kind of things in order to be responsible and not impulsive. And we're living in a very impulsive society, in a very impulsive generation. And it's a really telling thing that they also don't like imaginative things and pushing the boundary of creativity into things like fantasy. I think those things are correlative.
Yeah, yeah. I think that all of these things are consequences of enlightenment, where it's not just the problem of being logical. I love being logical. I love using intellect and knowledge to glorify God and dig for data, finding sources, scholars. I love these things. But the problem is when enlightenment came, it led in the last few centuries to some consequences, even resulting and culminating to something we call scientism, where science is the new religion. Science has to give all the answers. If science is not backing up something that I don't want to hear about it, it's false. And while that has a good side of it, it has one extreme, which is like you guys just said, well, what about creativity? What about beauty? What about emotions? And this is why romanticism started also a couple of centuries ago or a few centuries ago. Um, I don't know the exact date, as a counterattack, if I can say, opposing enlightenment. Like, hey, don't forget about us, guys. Art, beauty, emotions are still important, which I mentioned partially in the last episode when I talked about this movie Equilibrium, when in the future emotions are forbidden. It's like people are like machines, but then when emotions strike you, or where you observe an object of beauty or art, anything, music, book, anything, you start creating emotions in your dead, cold heart. So we can also see some spiritual messages, biblical messages in there, in that aspect. So scientism is not the result. Science is beautiful because it's God-given, but scientism is not. Um, okay, I know that Josh, with you, we talked a couple months ago. when it comes to storytelling, how all this work of fiction inevitably has monsters, so we don't have to repeat ourselves. And with you, Chase, we spoke last time about you as an author creating good characters, or let's say good guys who resemble some of your characteristics and attributes. So in that way, you're acting like God because these characters are made in your image. But Chase, when it comes to you again being an author, and maybe Josh, also you when you're preaching and giving stories or illustrations, what about those characters that are in the middle? I never read George Martin, but I heard that most of his characters are like between black and white. They're like neither good nor bad. They're just in between, like most common people we see every day. With some, it may prevail more good. With some, it may prevail more bad, or evil or sinful. Um, so how do you guys create these characters? Again, we already have monsters, and again, we already have good guys. Monsters can be demons, can be different creatures, beasts. Good guys can be knights, prophesied people that will be coming as knights, or kings, or maybe prophets or whatever. But how do you guys deal? How do you invent? And how, even when you invent them, how would you describe all these characters? They're just in between.
Well, I before Chase gives a more formalized author answer, I would say probably the way that you can think about those kind of gray area characters, the everyday Joe, right? Because like you said, it's almost as though like you can think of your neighbor is somebody who you probably know their good side, but if you knew everything about them, you would see them as a rather ambiguous kind of gray character. They're not perfectly good, they're not a hero, but they're also not a villain. Um, I think thinking about like everydayness makes us feel mundane, and so it's hard to be creative about mundane things. Um, and if there's something that like it, you can't have just plain supermen, right? But you also can't just have devils, and so you do kind of need that gradient, you know. So there's that's kind of where the space of, let's say, conversion is possible, is in those in between places, right? So I think that there's a real utility for those characters, even if they don't fit into an exact archetype. They actually can be sometimes the most relatable characters. And so oftentimes, if I'm thinking about, like, let's say I'm trying to make a story about something, or I'm trying to um, you know come up with a character idea or something with my friend who's writing, or I have a buddy who does film also, and it's like, if you're thinking about those things, what you want to do is try to back off of the idea of trying to make them into just a list of ideas, or just a like a set of propositions, and instead try to engage with the idea of a real person that you do know, and strip them of some of the most distinct parts of of how you see them as them, and just take the generality of maybe the kind of place they live in, the kind of personality. Are they loud? Are they quiet? Those kind of things. Rather than all their idiosyncrasies, you take some of their generalities, and then you can kind of just make something from there, in the same kind of compilation way that Chase was talking about the worlds. But I think that those characters can become really, really important in the moments of choice in story, and those kind of things, because those are the parts of the story that often feel most human, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, kind of going on off that point, I really do believe that in today's day and age of storytelling, the typical archetype characters aren't going to do anymore. Just the again, the Superman kind of character and stuff. Even today with Superman, I think there's an interest, and with Batman as well, to explore a more complex Batman character. And it's today, in today's day and age, just the average heroic character is, no one really wants that anymore. People want complicated characters. Unfortunately, I do think that that first of all, that I like that idea, but at the same time, um, it's going back to the Game of Thrones thing. That it's like we get too far into having an interesting, complex character that they're just not good or bad. We just don't know if they're a good guy or a bad guy character anymore, and we don't even want that anymore. We just want flawed people because we are flawed people, kind of thing like that, you know. Um, so it can go too far into where you're just making a completely nihilistic character that just has is not really all that inspiring at all. And that's for me. I think that's one of the big problems today in storytelling. And so what I want to do is I want to make characters that are complex, that aren't black and white. They have particularities about them that they have good qualities and they have bad qualities. At the same time, I have to make sure I remember who are still the good guys in the story and who are still the bad guys in the story. And the good guys may sometimes clash even with each other. They'll even clash with each other and create a conflict among each other. But I have to make sure that, like, they're ultimately still all ultimately on the same side. They just misunderstand each other and create conflict and stuff. But when I create a character, and if I were to give advice to somebody about making a character that's complex and interesting, I would always just tell one of the simplest ways you can do it. Typical character archetype, a heroic character archetype, make him a heroic character with a caveat. Make him heroic except for something. And like, he's brave and he's noble or whatever, but if something happens, a certain particular situation, he totally changes. And that instantly makes that an interesting character. It makes, like, well, why is it that situation that it makes people interested and want to know what's traumatized this guy or whatever. So you can do things like that to make complex characters, but um, I try to make sure that whenever I make each character, that I take one of their good qualities and I go, here's a good quality that this character has. How can it also create a negative effect and like a negative quality in something else? So a character that is very, like taking myself, for instance, being introverted. So I'm introverted. I'm typically very recluse and very quiet. I keep to myself most of the time. That allows me to think a lot and process information better than a lot of people. It also keeps me from saying something really dumb most of the time because I think about it. At the same time, that also can create a negative quality, which is so much too quiet, too isolated, that I become sort of antisocial. I would have bad social skills. Also, overthinking or thinking too slow. Like I tell people I have a slow processor. Like, if you were giving me in directions someplace, it's better just to give me the name of the address and I'll just put it in my maps and I'll just go. If you tell me you go down that street better and then you take a left, you take a right, and you get like you lost me, kind of like I can't process all that information really fast. So at the same time, that slow processor, that desire, that need to think slowly about things, to think carefully about things, can also be a bit of a detriment sometimes when you got to think fast. So things like that. So that's a sort of an example of making characters that are that have a quality about them that's good, but that quality can also have a negative effect and make them a character is in a certain sense broken and needs to be fixed. So a lot of the story would revolve around fixing that character. And one thing I told my editor, she thought it was interesting. I said, "You want when you want." Oh yeah. There was this. The way you tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys in your story of complex characters. So basically, key characters in every story have what's called their wants and what they need. Okay, so a character wants this one thing. That's what they want, and so they set about in the story getting what they want, trying to get what they want. But then there's what they need. As they go through the story, their need begins to rise, kind of come into the story, and the character then has to make a choice between what they want and what they need. Eventually, their wants and their need collide, and that creates the character. That really helps create the character arc. And you can do that with an antagonist as well. But the difference between the protagonist character and the antagonist character is the protagonist eventually goes for what they need. The antagonist character goes for what they want ultimately in the end, and they forsake what they need. So that's kind of maybe not even the antagonist, but the bad guy character. And so that's a way that you can really make sure, even with your complex characters, you know which ones are the good guys and which ones are the bad guys, because they are really important. I think it's really important that even though you have morally complicated characters in each story, that you still need to have your definite good guys and your definite bad guys. You don't want to be in just moral nihilism. Like again, like the Game of Thrones thing. I don't think that's a good idea. I think the characters, having complex characters like Game of Thrones, is interesting. But ultimately, I sit there and I go, where's the justice? Where's the ultimate justice in here? Of course, I'm a Christian, so my worldview has that kind of concept, happy endings and stuff like that. So where is that in the story? And if that's not what you're going for, then to me, honestly, I don't care how well it's written. It's a waste of time. So
Um, Chase, when you create your characters, well, first let me tell you, for me as an amateur author that is still not published, but I would love to continue writing when I have more time. Um, I pay more attention, much more attention, when I develop characters to their emotional, mental, and spiritual attributes and characteristics, way less than physical, way less for me. And this is why first I want to say how I do, and then I want to ask how you do it. For me, it's much less important if someone has mustache, how tall they are, what color they are, what race they are, how long is their hair, do they wear glasses, how big is their forehead, are they limping? And I see many authors, they pay so much attention to physically describe every single character, sometimes even to tiny details. They're like, okay, are you trying to make me visualize this person? Is this even that important? And for me, I would like so much more to learn about characters when it comes to their inner struggles, their issues, their mess, but also their virtues. So this is what I'm trying. I'm trying to be a little bit. I'm not saying better, and it's very hard to be original. Thousands of years since people have been storytelling and inventing stories, it's extremely hard to be original. But I'm trying to have less of a annoying and boring repetitive description in general of nature or people, and more to emphasize to something that is important to me, and not just to me. I think in general in life, I don't have to describe how were clouds and sun and wind that day, but I want to know what was happening in the heart and mind of certain people, how difficult was the challenge. I want to see the plot, like I want to see the dialogue. I want to see if there's any humor, if there's any drama, um, you know, some element of surprise, stuff like that. So that's why I'm trying to be a little bit different than the majority of fantasy authors. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you, for you as an author, do you also pay more attention to these inner attributes, or you maybe do like 50-50 with physical and like spiritual, mental, and emotional attributes?
Yeah, I focus. I really find the character and who they are much more interesting than what they look like. That's typically what I focus on. I do. So for most of my characters, I don't spend a lot of time, if anything, on their physical appearance. There are some that I just I have a particular way I envision them. Why, I don't know, but I just do. And so I give them a physical description. Anastaria, she kind of has very light brown hair. It's wavy hair. And then Stratos kind of has dark hair in the story. And some of the characters are a little bit more dark skinned and stuff. This is sort of the way I envisioned them. But again, a lot of that's just, it's not really meaningful. It's just kind of the way I envisioned them. So I do, even though I do give physical descriptions of many of the characters, some of the characters at least, um, it's I'm really want you to get to know who they are, who that person is, and why they are the way they are and stuff. But there are times though. I if I were to tell an aspiring author, give them advice, don't focus too much on the physical appearance unless it's important to the story. Like a character that needs glasses and wears glasses, if that's going to be important to the story, well, then put that in there. One of my characters, he has a scar, an interesting looking scar. It's not like a slash or anything. It almost looks like veins on the right side of his face, like, but there's scar. It's a scar, and there's a reason why that's there, and you learn about that later on in the story. So I make sure I put that in the story. This guy has a strange scar on the right side of his face. But even the characters who have scars in other places, I have a scene in the book I'm working on right now, the second one, where Stratos and this other character, they kind of have a bonding moment, and it's one of my favorite scenes that I've written. But the two are talking about scars that they have, and him and her, and Stratos sort of takes. I love. It sounds funny, but I love scars. Scars I find fascinating because there's so much so many analogous things you can draw from scars, and so she sort of talks about, in the scene about, how she struggles a lot with the scars that she has. But again, you're kind of wondering, does she mean physical scars, maybe emotional scars, kind of like that? And Stratos kind of takes the opportunity to say, well, what do you do with with a wound? You got to let it heal, and you can't scratch at it. If you scratch at it, it bleeds more again. It has to be patched up. It's got to be healed. It takes time to heal. And then, of course, what you're left with afterwards is a scar, the reminder of the wound, kind of stuff like that. So, but in a scene like that, I describe that this character has scars on them, but it's not just because, well, for whatever reason, it just got scars. But there's a reason why. There's a purpose for these descriptions, and that's a basic rule for anything with writing. Don't waste the reader's time. If you want to let them just sort of their own ideas what the character looks like or what this area looks like, well, then go ahead, let their imagination fly. If you need something specific to be envisioned, then put that in there, but don't waste a reader's time. If it's not important to the story, don't put it in there. Just leave it out of there. Just nation, take it where they want to. So that's sort of my general advice on that whole aspect, and that's kind of how I approach things. More about the character and who they are, and if the physical appearance is important, talk about that. But otherwise, just let the reader use their imagination.
Cool. Um, for you as an author, um, what when it comes to plot or themes or the setting in your world building, how do you find yourself as a man of God creating your own world, fantasy world? How are you different, or how at least do you see yourself different than other authors when it comes to these things? Like I said, the setting, themes, plot. Like if you can just, it doesn't have to be a very detailed answer, but like, are you trying to be a little bit original and different? And what would even inspire you? When you're in the process of creating these things.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that makes me very different from most authors in this genre is, I know I might sound biased, but I would say a sober reading of history. I'm honest. I get a lot of inspiration from reading history, recognizing that history is complex. Like you see a lot of I pick on the woke stuff, but you see a lot of the woke stuff today. They just see the world in black and white. It's just the colonials came over and they just killed everybody and blah 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 blah. And it's like, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And of course you got the Indian natives. They were all kind of killing each other too. Stuff. But there's a lot of there's just a lot of gray areas. It's not clearly black and white. And so I try to think about that. I want to make sure that I am creating a world that is authentic, that isn't just what I want to be true. It's the reality of the way things really are. And also, but the other thing I'll just mention real quick here I that what I'm focusing a lot on is the concept of the one and the many. I don't see that almost anywhere in anything. Like nobody really thinks about that anymore. But I think about it all the time. I'm always thinking about how do we find a sufficient unity that explains the diversity and stuff. And that's like one of the main central themes of my entire story is figuring that out. So the one and the many is another element of my whole story that I think makes everything like the way I'm approaching things very unique and and different from others. That's one of the things that's always in the background of my thinking whenever I put the story together, and finding that balance is really important. So yeah, I'll have there's actually characters in my story that are villains, but those villains are I actually build them off of things I actually believe. And but the problem with the villains is they take the things that I believe and they take them to the extreme and they go too far with it and they become villains. And so I'm setting up a scenario where he's a bad guy, but was he just a total bad guy? Maybe he had a point. He just went about it in the wrong way, And so uh, things like that, making villains that are more than one dimensional, villains that went wrong somewhere, and maybe they had a righteous cause but they went very wrong with it, which is again can be very historically accurate of a lot of people, people who and not only that, people who, like every single villain in the world, unless they're just complete total psychopaths, really believed what they were doing was the right thing, and they had some idea that they thought would make the world a better place, but the way they had some imbalance that's caused them to become evil and bad, and so those are concepts and ideas that I explore in the story, so I think that's what makes me a little bit unique in the whole thing. So it's not just fantasy, but I'm trying to incorporate a lot of important messages and meanings in the whole story.
Very nice. Both of you, I see you as storytellers and people who are using narrative to point other people to God, to spread the message of gospel, by using different techniques. For Chase, that's writing. For Josh, that's more preaching, using verbal skills. So, for both of you guys, when you know both of you who are storytellers and using narrative, um, can you just please tell me what advice would you give to those who are about to start a storytelling? Again, either in a written or oral way. Like what advice can you give them except what you already mentioned, Chase, like reading history and reading in general, so that the more you read, the more you have data and inspiration to start writing or speaking, teaching.
I'll let Josh go this time. He hasn't talked in a while, so I'll let him start this one.
I was actually just requesting yesterday of Chase that he should talk more. So I'm getting what I want. So I like reading and watching fiction specifically because there's only so much you can take of what we call reality before you want to do something with it. And I think naturally I kind of wander into things like fiction, personality wise. But also, I think that there are positive feedback loops that you can get into when you start to intake things that are, let's say, good stories. There's something about stories that, like, you can tell when that is like, that worked. That's the right story. That really worked. It's like, what do we even mean by that? I think that when we encounter a good story, especially if it's not one that's just an autobiography, or let's say a recounting of a history event or something like that, where it actually is real fiction, right? Um, there's something in it that allows us to not remain distant from it. You hear somebody else's story, you hear an autobiography, you'll identify with that person to some degree, but really it's like that story it's factual, it's true, it's this solid concrete thing that's over there that I can look at and I can like, but it's really separate from me, right? Whereas fiction, doesn't exactly, I mean, like the story belongs to somebody, but the way that fiction works is the story itself doesn't exactly belong in a part or a place or to a person. It kind of has this way of, like water taking the shape of its container, something like that. Fiction is something that we can begin to map onto ourselves. And I don't know about you guys, but when I'm reading something that's really compelling, I begin to dramatize in my head and almost with my body or with my face begin to, let's say, imaginatively try to create with my own persona what it would be like to be like what that person, like you were talking about, that psychological experience of the character in this scenario. It's not, there's only so much you can focus on in the external before you need the internal, and I feel like fiction gives you an internal that nonfiction often cannot. And I think that that's where you can have a real deep impact on somebody in a positive way, or I mean, in a negative way also, but in a positive way, you can really impact a person if you can get to the way that they think, right? Um, that's not to say that art or story can't be propagandistic, but to know that there are good stories, like I said, the ones that it's like that really worked, right? Usually those are the kind of stories that when you identify with them and you try, or you desire to try to embody some of the things, the elements that the characters have, these attributes, or perhaps some of the things that they did, or the way that they thought about things, you like some of those things can really stay with you when you, and it's almost like, and I make jokes about it with my wife. My wife and I like to do audiobooks together when we're listening to a book, and especially if it's one that I've read or gone through before, is like, oh, you haven't met this person yet, I can't wait for you to meet this person, right? But it's a character in a book, but it's like, I can't wait for you to meet this person. You can really kind of begin to populate your imagination in a way that begins to be something personal for you, but also like it's almost the right way to overcome our extroversion and introversion, is to kind of engage with these imaginary characters, and we can learn so much from them and garnish so much wisdom without having to have the god awful experience of having to go through what some of these characters go through, good or bad characters, right? And these things can really, I guess, just shape your perspective, shape your values, shape your motives, shape your like, because you, something that we talked about before also was that you become that which you worship, right? You become like those things that you emulate, that you imitate, right? And oftentimes we're looking for something to look up to. And so fiction and fantasy often will give you something to look up to, right? We want to be excited about things. We want to be surprised by things. We want our expectations to be violated in some way. You know, that I think oftentimes we don't really know how to articulate that. We don't know how to be excited about something. And so a story, just a fictional story, can kind of awaken something in you that brings your own imagination to start flowering again. And, oh, I could do this thing. And then you do it and you find, oh, you know what? I actually really enjoy this thing. I never would have thought to do this if it wasn't for X, Y, and Z. And so there's a lot of positive influence that can come out of the exploration of fictional writing, but also I think that you get the influence of the author as well, and they begin to be something like a lens that you can use to kind of view the world, and there's a lot of really great things that can come out of being influenced by things and not being self-referential. There's a lot of the world right now, especially in our like, let's say, freer, more flourishing societies, we're very inward centered. I'm going to look out for number one. I'm the most important thing in the universe to me. And fiction often emphasizes that something other than that really can exist, and we can share story, and this, like I said, creativity can unify us. And I think that fiction is not outside that. I think that's one of those things.
Yeah. So for me, uh, for advice that I would give, other than what I've been giving already, I was thinking about this last couple of minutes. I was like, what do I give? So what I would tell a new author, someone who's aspiring to be an author, something that I've learned is that your your brain and your mind is going to like be your worst enemy when you're writing, because yeah, it's gonna you're gonna sit there and you're gonna be like, all right, here we go. But then you're gonna be, especially on the very first page, because it's where you begin. You're like, it's like looking at a gigantic cheeseburger and going, how do I start this? Like, I don't even know how to begin. And it can be so daunting that you just go and you just don't even do it, uh like how do I do the first write the first sentence and stuff like that. I remember, reading somewhere that your first sentence has to hook the reader. It's got to be incredible. It's got to be amazing and great. By the way, I don't think that's true. I do think it's got to be interesting enough, but it doesn't. There's just all this advice that you get on YouTube from these authors or people, whatever, saying that you gotta, like, they set the bar so high that you just can't even reach it. So I try not to do that to people. I try not to intimidate, but just, like, instead, why don't you just have your first, not, it doesn't have to be your first. Like, when I read Dune, the Dune book, I was bored for like the first couple pages. It took a while for me to get into it. Like, I just kept reading it, and that could be just me, but I was reading and I was like, where's this going? And finally it started getting interesting for me, so it doesn't, it doesn't necessarily have to be an amazing opening. Dudes, just ask a question in the beginning. That's really all you got to do. Not literally. I mean, just set up something to where you cause the reader to ask a question. Why is this guy running? Why is so and so acting this way? And blah 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 blah. So that's one thing. But it ultimately, all that to basically say, what you really need to do is you just got to sit down. Actually, here's the first thing I would say before I get to that. You have to ask yourself, do I want to write? Do I have a desire to write? I mean, or is this just a phase that's just going to pass? And the way you really know is if this idea just never goes away, it's just constantly with you all the time. That's evidence that, God's put that on your mind and he wants you to write it, And so once you got that figured out, you sit down, and now you got to get past, again, your mind, your brain is constantly discouraging you, telling you, how in the world are you going to start? You can't start this. You know what you should do? You should go just take a break, even though you haven't even written anything. Just go take a break and come back later. And it's just going to constantly want to just come up with something else to do because your brain is just so discouraged and stuff. You got to kind of fight, right? You got to fight through that. And so you just got to start writing. I mean, it's really as simple as you just got to sit down and you just got to start writing. And then you might say, well, like I've seen in writers groups, people saying, I'm so stressed out, because, they say it's my first draft, but I'm trying to make it good and stuff like that. I'm like, it's the first reason why it's called a rough draft is because it's rough. It's pretty bad. It's messy. It's terrible. It kind of sucks. It's just really, it's all over the place. You got to sort of go, all right, like that's what I do when I write. This is a mess, but we're going to clean it up. It's just like you do with any kind of art. One of my favorite example to use is like, clay, and creating, clay vessels and stuff like that. It starts out with this big old lump, and it gets really messy putting it all together and getting the shape you want and stuff like that. But he just keeps going at it. And as he continues on and shaping it and stuff, it starts to come through, all the bumps and stuff, and everything starts to get smoothened out. And then he just starts doing all the fine details once it's all done. But it starts out messy. It's going to be a mess. It's going to contradict itself all over the place. You're going to have plot holes everywhere. You're going to have bad sentences all over the place. You're going to get all the stuff fixed. You get it all fixed eventually. But you got to just start writing, and you got to just start putting it down. Just get it on paper. Just get it written down. You're gonna have a bunch of passive sentences and stuff, just bad, all kinds of bad stuff in there. And as you start to just sort of go through it, you start taking out the bad stuff. You start fixing everything. With the one I'm writing right now, I mean, I got a bunch of plot hole issues. That's because a lot of times, and in many ways, I'm just sort of making stuff up as I go, and it's causing some issues here and there. But as I go, I start to develop who I want to be here, who I want to be there, who I want to make this decision, and what works best here. Does this scene work best, or maybe does this one work best? And then I'm just sort of, and maybe neither of them will work, and I come up with a different idea later on. You're just working out all the kinks as you're going, and as you're going. But so I would just tell that the main advice I would tell aspiring authors is, first, you got to really make sure you understand that you really want to write this. And if it's an idea that does not go away, that's usually a clear sign that you got to write it. The second thing is just write. Just write. Don't worry about how bad it is. Don't worry too much about spelling, whatever. Just write it down, get it on paper, and then you start to work things out. Because I promise you, once you get past, especially that first chapter, that's when you start to tell yourself, hey, I might be able to do this. I think I could do this, And then you just go to this next chapter, and then the next chapter. And the next thing you know, you've got 20 some odd chapters, maybe 30 chapters. And then you're going to get to that point. You're going to realize, I've gotten this far. Why would I turn back now? I've spent so much time on this thing. Yeah, it's a mess, but I'm not going to turn back now. I'm going to just keep going and keep going and keep going. Maybe get myself an editor. Like what I've done, I've got myself an editor. She's really awesome. She's going through my book right now, my first book, actually. So I'm getting that re-edited. And I'm really glad for that. I'm really happy for that. So, just things like that. So that's my, other than the things that I've been talking about already, that would be my main advice that I've learned, is that you just got to go. You just got to ignore your brain trying to tell you this isn't going to work. It's just all a mess. You just got to tell your brain, yeah, it's a mess, but I'm going to fix that. I'll get that fixed, and just go and just keep going, and keep going, and keep going, and keep going.
Chase, do you write outlines for your books? Because I don't, and I heard that that's very beneficial. And I understand, once when I start writing outlines, per Joshua Davidson, right, the guy right here who taught me when I began with the YouTube channel, he said, "Hey, you should be writing outline before every episode and then send to your guest." I'm like, okay, that's a good idea. I didn't think about it, but like writing an outline for a whole novel, that's another level of, I don't know. I don't do it. I just write as I go and I come up with ideas, which is not necessarily bad, depending on your brain and how you think. But also, I see it as a negative, in a way. Occasionally, get stuck and I don't know how to fix something so that I can move to point B. So I'm stuck. I don't know how to resolve something. Like, do you find outlines necessarily helpful, or you're always like, or you're like more like me, like flexible?
Yeah. So I saw on a YouTube video this editor. She basically has the scale of uh, the kinds of authors that are out there, and on one end of the scale is the planner, the one who just goes, like, just puts together this incredible outline before they really write the book. I mean, just this detailed outline and everything. And on the other end of the scale, they have what do they call it? What she called the pantser, the one who just flies by the seat of their pants and just goes as they're making it up as they go. And I find that it's a good idea to be somewhere in the middle. Again, it's a lot of this is just about balance, finding a good balance. I think hats off to the guy who can just completely plan out everything. How he does it, I don't know. I can't do that very well, because even when I do that, I've done that before. Even when I do that, I sometimes end up going. I get to a point where I go, well, you know what? I think it'd be a good idea to do this instead, and then I go off a little bit. I just can't help it. It just happens. But at the same time, I do think being the pantser, because I that's how I started. I started out with just being the pantser, the one who just making it up as I went. I didn't put a whole lot of thought into where the story was going, anything like that. And I ended up getting myself caught. Like I ended up going way out in left field, and like, how did I even get here? This is not where I wanted to be ultimately, and now I don't even know what to do because this story is just run straight into a wall. It's run into a ditch, and I got nothing I can do now at this point. So I think it can be a little bit bad to be a total pantser. So I try to be somewhere in the middle. So what I'll do is I'll design an outline. I'll actually write the story as I'm doing the outline at the same time, but the outline's going a little bit ahead of the story. But then I might come to a point in the story when I'm writing and go, you know what? Maybe I'll just change this up a little. Maybe instead of this character being here, I'll have this character. I think it fits better here, and whatever. I'll change the scene up a little bit. I'm going to take that out actually. So basically a very loose outline. I think just a general outline just gives you a general idea of where you want to go. Because I think it's really important. One of the things that's really important is when you're making a story, you have to ask yourself questions. And in many ways, a story begins where it ends. You have to really know. I think you have to have some idea how you want the story to end. At least the book. Like I don't like in terms of the entire series of my novel series. I have no idea how I'm going to end it right now. I am not that far into it, but I do know in particular like the books, the book series. I know how I really want those to end. And so you want to ask some questions. Where do I want the characters by the end of this book? What do I want them to have learned by the end of this book? And, so questions like that. There's probably a couple other ones I can't think of too much of right now, but those are some of the questions you want to ask. And asking those questions helps you decide, like once you answer those questions, then the story becomes how you get them to that point, to that area. So a way I like to describe it is when I go hiking and stuff, especially when I go hiking up like a mountain, I'll look at the point that I want to get to. I'll be like, that's where I want to get to. And that's my goal. That's where I'm going. And so then I decide, okay, what's it going to take for me to get there? What do I need to bring with me to get there? How much water do I need to bring and stuff like that, and to help get me to that point. Well, the same thing like in storytelling with your character. You decide, I want this character to be here in such and such a place at this point in the story. And then it becomes, how do I get that character there? What's going to be needed to get that character there? What are the things I'm going to need to put in the character's way to get that character there? So for an example, Anastasia in my book, The Master of Gears, she's a really like uptight kind of character. She's raised very disciplined in a very heavily religious setting. So she's very uptight, you might say, very strict and not very humorous.
Prudish.
Very prudish. And so that allows me to add a potential character arc for her, which is, first of all, that prudish nature, which is fine and all, it's great, but it can also make someone a little bit boring, and not all that interesting. And so I go ask myself, okay, well then what do I got to do to make Anastasia not boring? And I'm going to put a character in her way who's like the opposite of prudish. So I have a character in the story named Odin, who has nothing to do with the god Odin, by the way. I just named him that. But Odin's very laid back. He's just a chill dude. He's like, hey, let's relax. Anastasia is like, no, I got a quest I got to do. Odin's like, hey, man, you've gotten this far. Why don't you chill out and give yourself some kudos, a pat on the back, have a beer or something like that, And of course, Anastasia is like totally against all that stuff, But Odin's constantly trying. So Odin is a character in her who she comes into contact with, who's going to basically force her to really have to just take it easy and chill out. It's okay to relax sometimes and just calm down. And so those are some things that you can do when you have a character like that who has this particular attribute to them that can be good, but again, like I was saying earlier, can also lead to an imbalance. You put another character in their life that helps them correct the imbalance. At the same time, Anastasia's disciplined nature kind of helps Odin get a little disciplined himself, So they're kind of two characters that sort of help each other out a little bit, they really help each other in that sense. So all that to basically say, you want to have some idea of where you want the story to go, and it's always a good idea to kind of write it down in some way. It could be very vague, it could be very loose, because you want to have some wiggle room to change a few things. You don't want it to be a strict outline, but just enough to give you an idea of where you want to go, but a little bit of wiggle room to change a few things here and there, so that, you can, yeah, like I like that idea better, but not so much change that you just completely fly off into la la land, like, okay, I didn't want to go there at all. That's not where I wanted to go. And so, so it's really about, I think, finding that little balance between the planner and the pantser. Try to be somewhere between us. I'm naturally the pantser too. I'm like you, Nicola. I'm more of like the pantser type. So I've kind of had to get myself a little bit over to the planner side, because it helps me out a lot. For me, it helps me out a lot to have some kind of an outline to follow, to go to it's almost like creeds and confessions, sort of like they're sort of there to kind of keep you from going way off, way out, but I also try to have enough room to where I can just kind of move around a little bit in there, and just but at the same time go, okay, I like that idea, but it goes way off from where I want to ultimately go. So I probably shouldn't do that idea. So I'm probably going to have to leave that idea out. So that's sort of the way I go about it. A long-winded answer for that.
Yeah, cool. You know what's funny about me in real life? I'm not I'm not very impulsive person to do stuff without planning, especially if it's something big like vacation, or I went to school. I wanna, I don't make usually big decisions on impulses. I pray, I ask for advice, ask God to tell me, to confirm me His will. I like to know if we're planning a trip somewhere, when we're going, when we're coming back, what will we be doing this time, that time. So I like those things. But when it comes to writing, maybe just my laziness and not being organized. So then I just go and being creative, whatever. Okay, I would like to dedicate this last segment of the video to both positive and negative aspects of fiction, reading fiction, especially, not so much writing. And why is this? Well, first, for all those who are not accustomed to reading fiction, and there are brothers and sisters, but also to those who are used to read, but they don't see necessarily some red flags, or they may need to be warned about some stuff. So I would like to speak first about positive aspects, and I'll mention some, and you guys can continue after me. For me, one of the most important things when it comes to reading fiction, um, and again, this can be not just novels, this can be movies, video games. For me, most important thing is finding symbolic patterns in secular works, especially when it comes to heroes, superpowers, desire to do good, to do justice, stuff like this, which Josh and I already talked a couple months ago. But what do you guys have to say about something? Like, would you agree about this? This is one of the biggest benefits when it comes to fiction and fantasy specifically.
Um, last time we talked about this side of fiction with the, let's say, the motifs and the patterning of how stories are laid out, and the way that things can be repeated and yet not plagiarized, let's say. um, Life, real life, is a place where we can see things happening in, let's say, a rather patterned motif, and stories are laid out in a way that we can actually, especially stories that we like, let's say the stories that work, which is the ones that we've been talking about, is fantasies that actually make sense enough that somebody can be like, wow, yeah, and then have this experience of going through the story with you. Stories like that uh, can offer you, especially if you have a familiarity with a multiple stories. Let's say this, not your first fantasy novel, but like your 10th, right? Your fifth, something like that. You have this kind of span of things, right? You can notice similarities and contrasts between stories, the symbolic patterns that happen in stories. The ones that are the most true are the ones that we can actually experience and do experience in our lives day to day. Those are the ones that can be most impactful, right? Because you're going to notice, like, you take any, let's say, the natural motif of a story is The story itself is, and this is the, let's say this is the infallible outline, making a joke about the last thing we're talking about. You have A, which is where you are, and you have B, which is where you want to be, right? And the story is literally the going between those two things. That's how stories work. Ta-da, there's the formula. Like A to B, the going is the story. This is how this works. The good story, the ones that really work, have a slight addition to this. And these are the kind that, especially in fiction, use this motif, these two motifs, to really emphasize the overarching play of the story, is the tragedy fall or the redemption arc, because something happens between A and B that makes it a story rather than simply a list of things that occur, right? You need something that is a problem or a conflict, something that is added to the mere A and B, the going in between. The reason why we go and listen to fiction stories and fantasy stories is because these are the kind of things that show us in the most obvious, billboard in your face kind of way what happens when something interrupts your A to B, and what to do and what not to do in those circumstances. I think that's one of the most directly beneficial, obviously beneficial parts of fiction and fantasy in that way, and the symbolic patterns that, like I said, we experience every day.
Yeah, actually, and going on that point too as well. Like, for me, one of the most important things, the things that I focus a lot on, are um, the moral stories that we learn, and those can come in various different things. Like, uh, one of the ideas I'm exploring is what manhood looks like. I think that's something that's really important to talk about today. What it means to be a man, and um, but also embracing womanhood as well. What it means to embrace womanhood, going against the transgender madness that we encounter in our culture and stuff today. I think one of the things I remember talking with a buddy after church when we were out at lunch one time. I was just thinking about this while we were just sitting there, and I asked him, and he works with the kids and stuff. And I told him, I said, if you could give only one piece of advice to the kids at church, if you could only give one, what would you give? What piece of advice would you give them? And he thought about that for a moment, And then I just told him, you know what I would tell them? I would tell them to figure out, like to find who they are. And I know that sounds obvious, right? But I mean, like, because kids, I remember going through this, and I drive by a school like every day at work when I go to lunch. I see these kids walking along the sidewalks, and they're all dressed. I saw this one kid the other day, who had, like, one side of his hair was dark, the other side was a totally different color, and he's got these, like, checkered pants on, these weird colored shoes, and there's just so much going on there. And I'm looking at this kid as I'm driving by, and like, that's a kid with an identity crisis. He's trying to figure out who he is, and I think the most important thing for kids to learn as they're getting older is to find their identity and who they are. Find your identity and being, and whether you're a boy or a girl, growing, becoming a man or becoming a woman, but most importantly, finding your identity in Christ and who in Him. And so I think finding your identity is extremely important. I was like that when I was a kid. I think we all did, and we were all struggling to find out who we were. I'm at that point now, obviously, where I'm like, I'm pretty comfortable with who I am. And I don't really care what anybody else thinks about me. So, but kids giving into peer pressure all the time, right? Because, they want to fit in. I had this one kid at my church. He's a nerd, but he just doesn't want to admit it. And he's trying to be a cool kid. And I'm just looking at him. He comes up to me and he's like, "What's up, dog?" And I'm like, "How's it going, man?" Like, I'm just, and I'll poke around with him a little bit. I'll mess with him a little bit, because I'm like, I know you're a geek. It's okay to be a geek. Trust, I'm a nerd too, man. Don't worry about it. It's fine to be a nerd. Just embrace it. Just be cool with it, But I think that that's really something that's extremely important. That's something I want to another theme that I want to explore in my entire story is finding out who you are and why God puts you here, why you are where you are, and embracing that and just accepting that. It's not about, you know, defining your own destiny. It's about um, God's will, what God wants us to do, you know, like where we are, to do with what we have, where we are, and to be content with what we have. That's something I've learned in the last couple of years is just being content and just, you know, I don't have everything I want, but I got everything I need, and the Lord always supplies me with everything I need, and just being content with that has helped me change a lot of my outlook on life. And so that's stuff that's really really important for me to talk about in my story. So those moral stories, and learning about um, where we are in God's world, not so much where we are in our own little individual stories, but where we are in God's world. If you look at it from that perspective, that gives you purpose in life. That gives you meaning in life. It changes the way you look at everything. And so that to me is something those are things that I think are really, really, really important and you can convey those things in storytelling really well, I think.
Yeah. Um, I'm also reminded of passages like Hebrews 1 and Romans 1 that God has spoken to many different nations and people in the past in different ways and has given them, I don't know about special revelation, but at least general revelation. Um, I think, but I don't know would you guys agree with me, but I think that another positive aspect of reading fiction and fantasy could be that God has revealed some of his truth even to those who are spiritually blind, who then write novels and create all these characters that have that carry image of Christ in some way. They're not just heroes, right? Everyone wants to be a hero. I would like to be a hero. Uh, but they resemble more. They sacrifice. They just portray something so noble and something so um, kingly, if I can say that way, so royal that they resemble Christ. So, would you guys agree with me, especially based on Romans 1 and Hebrews 1, that let's say I'm an atheist and I grab a book by a fiction character and I read about this amazing hero. Then I do from another author and another author and another. And over the course of years, if I have analytical mind and if I can compare stuff, I can see some pattern in different authors and find this ultimate hero that may, just may, make me think about could there be an ultimate hero with a capital H that is uh, transcendent and bigger than all of this, and they're just there. All these heroes are just the like pale copies of this ultimate hero that he could be there watching over us or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of um, reminds me of, you know, like what I was previously talking about. Um, you there's many, again, there's tons of ways where um, and that's what I think is the beautiful thing too, by the way, of Christian authors, is because when we can, because like Josh was saying on the last program, the Christian worldview makes sense of everything, and it really does explain our entire universe and even our unbelieving neighbors, who read stories and write stories. Even they can't help but be what they are. And so, you know, like there's a game I played recently. It was called Kaina Bridge of Spirits, and I thought it was a really cool game. I really enjoyed it. There was a few things I was like, but I still enjoyed the game, and it was about this spirit guide named Kaina, who is helping corrupted spirits pass on to the next life. So I mean, it's not a totally original storyline, but still, when I was playing this game, I was just seeing tons of Christian themes in the game and in the story, and much of that was reconciliation, being reconciled with something that hurt you. So that's what kind of the main character who you play as, that's what she's trying to help all of these um, lost spirits do, is trying to help them reconcile with something that happened to them where they died without peace, and so their corrupted spirits remain, and she's got to help peace. Ultimately, they find peace sort of in forgiving themselves, and that's where I would say, it's really mostly about finding peace and forgiveness from God. It's really where what ultimately it comes back to. You need to be reconciled to God, and so yeah, one of the things I like to talk about as well is really important to me is um, that concept of reconciliation, being reconciled to God, that you can see in many and on every story, like Josh was saying as well. There's got to be a conflict going on. Something has been broken, and that for a good story to exist, something has been broken and it needs to be fixed. That's what it's all about. It's redemption, it's restoration, it's reconciliation. So in my story, you're going to see all these characters that have been broken in some way. Something has happened to them. They've something has traumatized them or something like that. They've got a scar. They've got a wound somewhere, in a traumatic wound that needs to be healed. And they go about many ways of trying to fix it. And most of those don't work. And most of those are running away from the truth. But in the end, you're going to see them eventually again. It all, even though they all have different stories, there's that theme that connects them all, and it's the same thing. It's finding peace, it's finding restoration, and that ultimate restoration is, of course, with God. Even the characters that I have in the story who are going to be unbelievers, they're gonna ultimately come to that point. And I want to do my best, by the way, even when it comes to atheists, to represent atheists as best I can, not as just these jerks, these meanie heads who are just always whatever. I'm even going to have some of the atheists in my story actually much more righteous than the religious people. And because we have a lot of that in real life. I've met many atheists who are really nice, and a lot of people who call themselves Christians and stuff. Well, it's kind of like, and so I want to make sure that I have these characters who may be atheists, but ultimately come to some kind of reconciliation. And but that's one of the things I think is really important, that the gospel talks about, and that we all have within us, is we've been broken. Our relationship with God's been severed, and what the Bible's about is God fixing that. And so in storytelling, that's what it's also about. I'm every time I watch a movie, every time I read a book, every time I'm whatever, I'm always thinking about what's been broken and what needs to be fixed and how does it get fixed. And that's why I don't like stories that don't do that, that have unhappy endings. I love happy endings, because happy endings are like what the Bible is, a story which somebody had something broken and it was fixed. And I go, oh, that was a good story. I like that story. So yeah.
So I think that, again, like Chase was just bridging, this question is so relevant to the last one. The symbolic patterns that we were describing, that we experience, and that's what the stories are, they're just built out of these patterns. Our experiences and our expectations even are kind of built around these patterns. When you look at the way that these patterns bring to us a fulfillment, oftentimes you're looking at things that we would formulate as like virtues, the good, right? Like the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those are the things that in good stories, even if they're tragedies, they can show you something good, true, or beautiful, or all three, right? And the best stories are the ones that can give you all three, right? And I think that in seeing the way that we've been talking about these things, and they take shape in this way, you can see that heroes and power and good and a desire for the good of others, and even the element of something that we haven't mentioned thus far, I think, as probably as readily as we should, is self-sacrifice, is the element that really distinctly is the Christian value from the Christ himself, is that intentional knowledge of self-sacrifice, that intent, and your action following your intent rather than your action following your impulse, and your intent being something that's sluggish or weak or even non-existent because we just don't, we're unthinking and impulsive sometimes when we do things. It's like those moments when we've forgotten the future are when you really are more ready to sin. You're not thinking about what's coming. You're not thinking about what comes of this. You're not thinking about the framework of a story. You've kind of forgotten the story. So it's like to be conscious of the story, to see that there are heroes in the story, and something that we've talked about before, at least Nico and I on the first episode, was if you take the condensation or the distillation of a lot of different characteristics or a lot of different themes or these motifs, patterns, let's say, about the hero character, and then you add this element of self-sacrifice and humility, like a lowly character, and you get this kind of opposite ends meeting in not in a contradictory way, but in a complementary way that unifies and creates something much bigger and deeper without compromising goodness, right? That kind of hero, that kind of distillation, if you could combine those things properly, I believe that if you could distill all of those characteristics from even all story in all human history, what you would receive is something like that perfect archetype, right? Like I really believe there's nobody that fulfills that extremes meeting in the center perfect archetype of goodness more than Jesus Christ. That is the ultimate fulfillment of story. There isn't a higher one, right? So much so that it's the story of Christ, and this his heroicism is a story that we don't have a beginning or end to without actually making reference to the fact that he was at the beginning and will be at the end, and his claim to be the beginning and the end. It's like all of these things wrap into something that is very conspicuously story like. And so to recognize and be aware of, and even most of the time live as though we're aware that our small idiosyncratic piece of reality that we get to experience in our own personal experience, right? That story is nested in a much larger framework of something like a super overarching story that has a continuity that goes back, that we don't really have a way to envision it other than to think about it mythically, right? Like all of these things kind of really do, even experientially, point us right back to the fact that there is a source, and therefore there can be a purpose, there can be a meaning for what it is that we're doing in life. And so Christ is the answer to all of the greater questions that man has come up with in life. And I believe the question of the creativity of humankind as well as logic of humankind are all going to point back to truth. And Christ claimed to be truth. Like he said, he was the way, the truth, the life, right? Those things are very strong, exclusive statements about himself. And if he's telling the truth, because he would be truth, if he's telling the truth about that, then we shouldn't be surprised when things that are true can bring to us a referent for him. It makes perfect sense and has perfect continuity. And like we've been saying already, Christianity is a worldview that can make the most sense out of the world. It just is. And so if we're living in the Christian story, and I believe that we are, then Christ is going to be the answer.
Yeah, I would like to like merge two less positive aspects of reading fiction into one. We have all heard of the saying that reading fights ignorance, which is very true, of course. And for all the viewers out there who are watching this episode, I would who are not very who are not so much into reading, especially not fiction, because they might find it boring or wasting time or how is this contributing to my spiritual walk? Oh, this is all godless stuff and all these excuses. I would just encourage you. You don't have to grab a novel that is 1,000 pages, or a series like The Wheel of Time, almost 15 books in a series, right? You can start with something simple, even if it comes from secular artists and authors. This can be it can be a standalone novel, or it can be a trilogy. But like, books don't have to be longer than 200, 300 pages each. And I will almost guarantee that you will learn a lot of stuff, even from the things that you disagree with. And by reading and reading and reading, this will fix your false narratives, your false presuppositions and assumptions. This will help you as a preacher and as a theologian. This will help you as a father, as a parent. This will help you as a teacher and as a professor. And it will also help not just your family and yourself, but I believe also your congregation. Whenever you, whoever you are, any viewer, whenever you are serving in any shape or form in the kingdom of God, it will help you to analyze better what is out there, and to be able to formulate better whenever you give illustrations, whenever you have to write outlines, whenever you have to write a sermon. Maybe you have your own blog, maybe you like theology, but you're not so much into these things for whatever reason. I would just encourage those people to start reading book. You don't even have to spend money. You can join a local library. You can read reviews online first, and then go grab and just loan those few books, or just one book, and start with that. I bet it will enhance your life, spiritual and mental life, in ways you don't even expect. So before we switch to negative sides or negative aspects of fantasy, I just want to ask you guys, would you agree with this statement, and why?
I would say, yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that there's that, as I was just saying, the stories are something that I I don't know that you can be connected with reality in any real way without story. Like you, I really am convinced that you have to behave as though you're living in the framework of a story in order to be having a goal orientation, because you're just right back to the reference of you're in A and you want to go to B, and then you have the going in between. That it, like, you're living in the framework of a story. I don't see that anybody can really go through life in any fulfilled way and end up being filled full, right? Which is what fulfilled means. You're not going to be filled full if you don't recognize that what you're doing has meaning and has purpose. And you can't like the people that live as though their life has no meaning and purpose either don't live long, or we put them in solitary confinement. Like, you have to live as though this is true. And so, not having our children, our congregations, or any of our friends, or because I have kids, I want them to know what life is like, right? But I don't want them to have to learn it through making mistakes, or being wronged, or having tainted experiences, or being traumatized in their own experiences. Like, I don't want them to experience those things, but I don't want them to be ignorant of those things. What am I to do? Like, I need to give something, and I need to receive something that's going to be informative for me so that I can live. That's my main problem, is I'm living. What am I to do with it? You know what I mean? Like, we really do need stories, and those things are, it's exactly that. It fights the ignorance of, what do I do now? I have no clue. And that feeling of I have no clue is exactly where anxiety is waiting to just point out every part of reality that feels like that. Like, and people, especially in the modern age, we're so fast paced, and we do these things, like, chaos is so disruptive, and we just don't know how to react to it. And it's like, story is something that can give you something to work with, even if experience is lacking on your end. That's something that, like, our ignorance often gets us into more trouble than it should, you know and education at school and like, mathematics and things, it's like that's all really well and good, being able to use, skills and stuff like that, and functionality in that kind of way is really great. But story brings you, like we were talking about before, this moral character depth, right? You want to have a good character, like what kind of character are you embodying is a really great question to ask yourself at the beginning and the end of the day, you know and so I think that thinking this way and living as though that were true is something that can be really beneficial to anybody, but especially in the Christian worldview that we've been describing.
Well, I would I think back to again when I was at Chick-fil-A earlier this week, and those girls were sitting not too far away from me and just talking about nothing really interesting or important. And there's just I look at them and I'm like, there's just so much ignorance there. And probably from a lack of reading. Don't read very much. If they do read, it's some quick little Instagram thing. That's it, but there's nothing much going on there at all. And I also think about this silly, stupid little quote that I heard for a while. In order to be old and wise, you must be young and dumb. And I was like, you don't got to do that. You can just be young and very observant of the young and stupid, and then you don't have to make those mistakes. So, and that's kind of where I was. I was like, I'm not going out doing all that stuff, partying and drinking and everything like that. I've heard about what happens to people in there. I know it's typically rare, but hey, it still happens. I don't want that happening to me. So I'm not going to go do that stuff. And so, um, uh, you know, reading has really helped me learn to be more patient. It's helped me whenever I read stuff that, for example, things that I typically wouldn't agree with. It helps me to go, oh, I never, thought about it like that before. That's an interesting way to look at it. It helps when you read a book. Well, today's day and age, not we don't even know anymore with AI just making writings now, but usually when you read a book, you are reading the thoughts of another person, the thinking of another human being. And so you are, I heard it explained to me this way once, is when you read someone's book, you are entering into their mind. And so when I read books from other people, it helps me to think about things in the way that they think about things and to understand things and they bring about points that I'd never thought about before. Um, and so it just helps me overall understand things a little bit better. And then I take a lot of that and I go into when I write my stories. Even though I may be portraying a particular perspective that I don't agree with, I also want to make sure that I'm being fair and honest to that perspective, representing it correctly. And at the same time, perspectives that I more agree with, I put those in there and I try to make them compelling as well, so that people who are reading my novels and stuff might also come, who might not agree with me, might go, oh, well, I never thought about that myself either. So, maybe I got to rethink some of this stuff, and maybe there's more to this religion stuff than what I typically thought was just a spaghetti monster in the sky kind of stuff like that, um, and they might reconsider some things, and especially when you have I want to ask serious questions of like everybody, whether you're religious or not, or whether you're a theist or not. I want to get you asking questions. I want you to, if you're a religious person, for example, and you believe in God, as we all do, but I want you to start asking questions as the scientific, as technology increases. I want you to begin to ask questions about what does this mean for religion. Not just ignore those questions, but those are serious things that, as science, even our modern day increases, we need to really think about what this means for us as Christians, and as believers. At the same time, if you're an atheist reading my book, I want you to also be asking questions about, if I am this, if there is no God, then what does that mean about this and stuff, and real questions to be asked about atheism and what it ultimately amounts to. So I want to try and do as best I can to have just that well-rounded, balanced understanding of things and the way people think, and try to bring as what I've read all that together to get everybody who's reading my books to go to really ultimately fight against their own ignorance of people who are different from them. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that doesn't mean that, again, I'm going towards a moral nihilistic kind of thing like that, where there's no right or wrong. There is still very clearly a right and a very wrong kind of thing like that. Like, just making sure I'm clear about that. I'm not confusing anybody about that. But ultimately, is that if we're going to make any real progress towards a better society, we need to really consider what other people think on that side, and what they think on that side, and try to go, oh, okay, so I I understand that now, and two things can be true at the same time. You can understand how someone thinks and not necessarily agree with them. Like, it's possible to do that stuff, and it's our society today. People just seem to not really think that. Just think, you can't just. If I tell somebody that, like, I have friends at church and I say, "Well, I understand why they believe this," and they immediately start arguing with me as if I'm holding that position. I'm like, I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm just saying this is why they think like that. That's all I'm saying. And if you're gonna properly interact with them, you need to understand where they're coming from and why they believe what they believe. And so that's sort of my sort of answer, long-winded answer to that, about what the benefits are of reading and how you can use fantasy, novel storytelling to um, to that degree. It's just, so, again, there's so many cool things you can do with it. So yeah.
Yeah, I would, for a change, like to start hearing teachings and sermons which have less illustrations that have to do with athletes or businessmen. Of course, I always wanted to refer to theologians and patristics, apologists, yes, but also I would like, if pastors and preachers or chaplains, if they would start introducing more authors, book authors. This will um, hopefully intrigue the mind of the congregation, so they can be like, oh, who is this author, who's this person, let me take a photo, if I see something on the screen that pastor or preacher is showing, let me go maybe research, maybe go to library. And this, I believe, uh, this is a perfect example how one person who is in an important position, how they can positively influence a lot of other people. But let's before we conclude, let's just speak briefly, please, about negative aspects of fiction. I'll start first with, and this is true for me. Many Christians would complain that fantasy is sort of you escaping reality, you're hiding from what's real, you're just trying to escape into something that is fictional and doesn't exist. You're trying to escape problems and reality. And for me, this is partially true, and I'll say how. For me, doing full-time school and full-time work for 4.5 years has been exhausting me and killing me in a way. Also, I'm not a person who watch the news. I'm not a person who likes politics, and every time I see something or hear something, it's usually depressing. Inflation, crime, wars, all these things. So in a way, I do want to turn off, or at least silence my phone, not study for school, not work. I just want to have also some time for myself and start a new book series where I can enjoy this, new fantasy land, new world, and just be excited about what I'm learning and finding. And at least for a second, um, trying to imagine myself as I'm there and to enjoy some other reality. Well, of course, I'm not completely cut off from this reality. Um, how do you guys see about this thing? Is it necessarily negative? How negative it is, or it's a combo of good and bad? Do you find yourself also sometimes shutting down or shutting off from this world and just like immersing yourself into something you start watching? It doesn't even have to be a novel. It can be like a wonderful TV show you've been watching episode after episode, and it's like this is time for yourself where you find yourself completely enjoying this. You don't want to deal with the world, at least for that time. That belongs to you.
Yeah. I do think that there, kind of like I was saying in the last program, I think if the only reason that you're consuming fantasy or whatever is escapism, then it is kind of like it can be like a drug. But at the same time, I also understand, and I do sometimes will watch something that I go, I just want to watch a nice show or whatever and stuff. And I don't want any politics in it and stuff. It just a good story, make me like the characters and stuff and whatever. And so I do a little bit of that as well. I don't think there's any problem with trying to um, sort of just turn off the craziness of the world for some time. Um, so I do, but I do still think that I do still think that it can be negative if the only reason you're doing it is because of just want to get away, kind of stuff like that. I just I want my drug or whatever and stuff like that. So I think again, there's a balance to be had. It's the same thing with like video games. I hope I'm not getting too ahead of ourselves here, but it's like as you probably already know, I play video games. I don't play them nearly as much as I used to, but because when I was younger, I would play literally all day for hours, just constantly. I mean, I would just stay up all night long playing video games. That's an imbalanced view of it. I'll play them here, every once in a while now. But like recently, I made the big mistake of buying the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, and that was a mistake because I'm never going to finish that. I beat the games before when I was younger, and I had way too much time on my hands. But now I have too much going on. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to beat this. Like so it was like not a really good investment to go on. But the point is that if it becomes too much of something, then it becomes, I think, becomes a bad thing. So storytelling can be that. It can do that if it's just getting away all the time. At some point, I think storytelling needs to, and it has the power to, and we should embrace this, the power to not simply have us go, I just want to get away from it, but we can really make a difference in our culture through storytelling, and we can actually impact culture through storytelling. And so we should embrace that, and not just use it to just want to get away, kind of stuff like that. But again, just to be clear, I'm watching on Netflix a series of unfortunate events TV show. There's nothing political about it at all. It's just a fun show. I really enjoy watching it. I really want the orphans to find a happy ending, and that's it. So so that's just a little something I like to watch. Just to kick back for a little bit.
Oh man, looks like he lost connection.
Yeah, I was just about to say that's okay.
That's a bummer.
Your turn, Josh, and then I'll comment. Oh, here he is. Okay, that was fast.
Wow. Yeah, that was fast. Did it work?
Um, it seems like he's trying to regain his video connection. So maybe
Hmm.
yeah, just go ahead and then he'll
Okay.
connect. Oh, there he
Oh,
is.
there he is. There you are.
Yeah. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, that was my answer. So that was God telling me to. All right, you're done.
Oh man.
You're a
Right on.
reformed person. I would not expect you to believe that.
So
uh,
the question is, are there negative aspects of reading fiction or let's say interacting with fiction or fantasy things?
Yeah, especially the first part will be when we try to escape reality. So that will be the first sub point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think Chase is on the right, is definitely on the right trail when he's talking about when a thing is done too much, it can start deteriorating the good of it, right? Um, Imagination is not a bad thing until it becomes delusion, right? Um, Fantasy is not a bad thing until it becomes a trap, let's say. There are things like, let's say, role play is something that is very much the same as imagination, or like, let's say, um, in a more like down to earth, immediate sense, I used to sell vehicles, and there's something about the way that you would have to adjust the way that you're talking to somebody, or the way that you would explain something based on who you're talking to, and you kind of have to have something like a role play at hand to be able to fit a circumstance. And so we're really rather familiar with this already, if we're willing to kind of use it that way. But if you start thinking about role play in a way that people use it now, where it's become kind of a hobby, it's something that can be like a unity and join people together. There's still more good for it, right? But then you get things like the World of Warcraft wave that swept us about a decade ago. That was a really, really big thing, and it probably still is now to some degree. But there's more diversity in the games that people will do this with. But if for a while there, it was specifically, if you heard somebody say, "I play World of Warcraft," you can almost assume they don't do anything else. That's all they do, right? And it can be consuming. And that's the thing, is if fantasy is becoming something that is vampiric on your life, and you're not going out and doing, you're not actually reaping the benefits of the fantasy, you're being eaten by it, let's say. um that's what's really happening. And so it's not like other things don't have the potential of this same danger, right? You can be consumed by any other thing that you become very deeply impassioned for, that gives you some level of that feeling of being full, that fulfillment, filled full. That's the experience that you want to have. And you do this thing. It If you're doing it purely through fantasy only, and it never leaves the realm of the imagination and becomes something embodied, then you're cheapening the thrill, and it becomes something that no longer can work unless you're fully consumed. You know what I mean? And it becomes something, like Chase said, like an addiction, where you become like literally consumed by this thing. And that can be really detrimental. But like I said, anything can happen to you that can become that impassioned thing that becomes, let's say, um, like a blinder to the rest of everything else. Young men get this way about their first lady, let's say, and their friends are like, "Shut up, dude! Stop talking about her. Just stop. Say something else." Right? You all you do is talk about this girl that you met. That's all you talk about, ever, 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 and you never even hang out with us anymore. And then when you're with us, all you talk about is this. Right? It's like that person can be exhausting because they're like a cyclops. They can only see with one eye. There's nothing else there, right? Like, to continue the fiction analogy, but it's like noticing that we can become the things that we're seeing in the fiction novel. Don't become the prince trapped in the basement of the evil witch. You know what I mean? Like, don't become that guy. That's what you can become. You know what I mean? So believe the cautionary tales you're reading, and you won't have this happen to you.
yeah, I think that you really summed it up, like the point I was making, really well. When it becomes delusion, that's when it becomes bad. So
Yeah. So okay, thanks. That will be the first negative side of fiction. Let's say that the second one is, and this is true, that many fantasy and sci-fi authors, they're very anti-church and anti-God. They have this very strong, opposing, rebellious view of anything godly, religious, biblical. And I know that in many examples. One of the latest examples is I finally watched to the end his Dark Materials TV show. I didn't read the books, and I don't plan to ever buy them. The author is clearly very anti anything religious, but he portrays God, which I think he named him Authority with capital A, and he portrays Magistrate, which is like the global church, which looks so much like Catholic Church, I believe. Um, he portrays both of these as controlling, negative, manipulative, either beings or institutions. They're trying to take all your freedom, and those who are rebelling and woke in a way, they're good guys. They're trying to escape all this prison and stuff, and you can see that this dude is clearly anti Bible. So in examples like that, when an author is clearly, he or she is not hiding his agenda, I can see where fiction or fantasy can be negative. Another example would be when an author is religious, but he or she's coming from a cult like Mormonism or a fake religion. So, for example, in the last several years, maybe even a decade, or I don't know for how long, Brandon Sanderson has been one of the most popular fantasy authors in the whole world. His books are well read. He's loved by many. He recently had was it a campaign on Kickstarter or something? So he amassed amount of like I don't know how many millions and millions and millions of dollars. He like broke some record, but he's a Mormon. So this is what because I'm a member of some Facebook pages of epic fantasy lovers, and they're usually stationed in Eastern Europe. So I tell my own people who don't understand that Tolkien is a Christian author, even though he doesn't have to say, "Hey, this is from the Bible." Even though Tolkien did say that he doesn't like allegories. By the end of his life, he said that the Lord of the Rings is a very Catholic work. So the same way I see that the Bible says that whatever lies in your heart comes out of you. It doesn't have to be expressed in word. It can be expressed in a written way. So the same way Tolkien would make this Christian allegories or themes, or Lewis would do much more clearly without hiding. I see, it's impossible for Brandon Sanderson to hide his Mormonism, or for any other author to hide his own or her own religion, or a cult. So, what can we say briefly about this second negative aspect of fantasy, where authors are either anti-God, or where they're just portraying their own cult or their own false religion and just trying to influence their readers through their narrative?
Yeah, one of the guys I listen to his podcast, one of his little sayings he always does is "No man can rise above his own worldview," and I think that's really, really, really well said. And that's yeah, I see that in the works of pretty much everybody. I mean, I think everybody I've read about, and I can see a lot. Like when I watch a show or something like that, it tells me a lot about the people who put it together and what they believe. Um, I think in terms, this kind of gets on something we mentioned maybe a little bit earlier. That storytelling. This is one of the negative aspects of it, is when you're preaching at an audience. Like, you got to have your worldview. It's there, and it's going to, it's just, you just can't make it go away. um but then of course the real question is, and like, even my worldview, clearly, it comes through, but my worldview allows for me to speak truth and honestly about other people who disagree with me. But then, like, what do these other worldviews do? Do they allow them to do that? Like this, like the guy you were just talking about, the show, that show you were watching. I've heard about the show. I've never really checked it out, but he's his portrayal of God and religion, we would consider that not very accurate at all. But then again, does he have a worldview that's honest and accurate, and actually have a serious interest in real history of Christianity and stuff like that to make this idea? But he doesn't. He just sums it all up to just, well, it's just these people who just want to control everybody. That's just all it really is. And so he's going to make his world like that. That's how he's going to design everything. And it's also very, maybe he doesn't intend this, but the way you're describing that whole story, it's a very communist idea. The proletariat versus the bourgeoisie kind of concept stuff, and so, which is normal, which is, that kind of makes sense with that's kind of who Karl Marx was, atheist, and saw religion as nothing more than an economic construct to control the masses, so it makes perfect sense. And so that's where, I think when you allow a worldview to, or at least your worldview, it shows through in your writings, and then you can kind of see the holes in the worldview when you watch the show or you read the book or whatever. I do it all the time, like I'll watch something that's trying to portray Christianity, but clearly in a negative light, and I'm just like, and like portraying the Christian as just this buffoon who's just kind of dumb and doesn't know what they're talking about, and I'm like, come on, man. I mean, this is but at the same time, it happens on our side as well with a lot of the movies and stuff we make, when we try to make atheists look like a bunch of meanies and a bunch of jerkheads. But that's not what the Christian worldview should be like. We should be people who can tell the truth, and we should be honest about what people, and not be afraid to properly represent others of different perspectives than us, because our worldview kind of demands that we do. It's this little thing called like the ninth commandments, and you shall not bear false witness, you shall not lie about other people, basically. So I'm not saying we're all perfect in that. I'm certainly not perfect in that. I do my best, but that's where I think if we want to talk about that negative aspect of novel writing, it's when it shows the weakness of a worldview and the sort of flaws of a story, and not flaws in terms of like plot. Like it could that show you were mentioning could have a really good plot, but yet the worldview makes it a flawed show. Ultimately, a show has serious weaknesses and serious issues, even though it could be a pretty fascinating plot. So that's just kind of something I would say to that.
I can think of at least one of the most ready examples in my brain of something that is anti-church and anti-God in a novel that I actually can appreciate its place in the novel is in Brothers Karamazov, the character of the Grand Inquisitor, and the way that this question is laid before you, right? And even in other novels, Dostoevsky did this. He talked in Crime and Punishment with what's the guy's name? Raskolnikov. He has this moral dilemma about, am I good or am I just a coward? Right? I could be great. These moral scruples are holding me back. Ask the question. That's actually really relevant. Are you good or are you just afraid? Because if you ask you that, you really start asking yourself that question and let your real self start to act, like not the face that you want to present to people, but privately in your own self, be like, do I do the right thing because it's right, or because I don't want to get caught, because I'm afraid of what might happen? Am I just a coward, or am I actually aiming at good? Right? Because it's like, as a Christian who's trying to think about positive and do good and love other people, often we don't have these contemplations. But boy, do they become relevant when you have those darker moments and you have to ask yourself, what in the world? Well, I didn't even think I was capable of that. Why would I do that? And to be able to confront that, like you can be, like, if you can't be a villain, you probably can't be a hero because you don't have any power to you, you know? And so you need to be aware in some sense. Your enemy can tell you the truth in a way that your friends sometimes can't. And so sometimes it's really worth listening, because I've heard atheist critiques of God or the church that people probably should listen to and take to heart, not because not because they're exactly true, but because the stereotype exists for a reason. You know what I mean? And there are things that we can do. The main charge that people have against the church even now is it's full of hypocrites. It's like, this needs to be something that we can then take seriously enough to learn from and stare in the face. Otherwise, we'll never overcome it. And so I think there can be positive things that come out of that, but obviously you don't want to read it just because of that, or you don't want to, oh well, it's fine that they do this, and I don't, I don't want to bother that I can bend all these rules. It's just a book. It's just no. You're being influenced. Make no mistake. You're being influenced by the things that you choose to participate in when you read, or when you view things, when you listen to those songs. These things do, like, we're talking about these things as though they're impactful, because they're impactful. So make no mistake, these things are impactful, and you need to be aware of the fact that everything you read isn't going to be something that can perhaps offer you positive influence. But that's, again, sometimes there are things that you can garner from that. So it's kind of a cautionary thing. There are dangers to that.
Yeah. Couple more negatives. This is, I think this example will perfectly bring Christian division in a good way. Um, and this is how I've noticed with Tolkien, like the king of fantasy, right? The king of authors among the fictional, I mean, among the fiction, the genre of fiction. Um, I would notice books, I would notice reviews, I would notice people commenting, and I'll be observing. And this is what I noticed: these are the works of Tolkien. This is what his son and other people contributed. These are the part of the original canon. They would use the word canon. I'm like, wow, man, that sounds so familiar. Then they'll say these are all extra books. I'm like, okay, that sounds like formation of the Bible. We have the original, or not the original books, but we have the books they belong in the Bible. Then we have Apocrypha. Then they will speak about, um, just people would debate different topics about, it doesn't have to be Tolkien, but Tolkien is perfect example, and they'll have different conclusions. And even Tolkien would have his own scholars who would think this way, then his scholars that belong to other camp, they will say another thing. So I was like observing this over time. I was like, wow, this sounds so much like the church being split into denominations and having different camps. And sometimes there is beauty in that people love talking, and people agree about stuff, but there can be also division, and people can argue, it can get nasty. So I was like, wow, this is a perfect example of how in some churches there's such a deep division, um, almost like an abyss between, in the whole Christendom, between churches and denominations, because this church is independent, this church is independent, this church thinks they're the best, this church thinks they're the best, or this church think they're right, or this church think they're right. There's no brotherhood, there's no unity among them. And then when I was reading about canons in Tolkien's work, about different scholars saying different things, I was just reminded about the negative things we have in Christianity. So maybe quickly, guys, do you just agree with me, or like not? What do you think about this?
Well, I think that the existence of something like a canon isn't something that we can see as a negative necessarily, because that whole concept carries over into our thinking now, and we even have that terminology specifically because Christianity was the dominant religion in the West for literally millennia, right? So it's actually a sign in the end that we won. Like the pagans didn't win, like we won. Like Christianity, it like broke the world open, like wide open, right? So the idea that even in things that aren't necessarily religious texts, like the fact that we have books is something that's a product of Christianity. And so I think that we can see it as derivative, but I can see that people using their passion towards something to be combative and even disagreeable or sometimes nasty to one another, like you said, and be divisive, often on purpose, just to be inflammatory toward one another, and bullying and things like that, that happen sometimes when people are discussing these things. They have these disagreements, they take it so seriously, right? And I think it's because oftentimes, well, first, that they're just passionate about it, and passion is something that can be good but can be excessive and lead people again to be kind of under the influence, like being drunk leads you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't be rationally doing. Your passions do that as well. And so there are things that, you know, we begin to treat them as though they were God, and we have these weaknesses. And though that's a perfect example of how those things can bear out to make real life in your face divisions over something. So it's because they take it seriously, but you take it to a point that is, again, excessive and makes it inordinate, something that is wrong, and makes it sin.
I agree. I think that was very well stated, and I will just let that be as it is. So, very well said.
Cool. I have one more thing. I heard someone giving this verse from the Bible that I think exegetically, when we check, especially if we are called to be a good Bible students, then we should compare different Bible translations. So I would read from two of different Bible translations, Proverbs 12:11, and without me imposing my view and my understanding of this passage, can you please, gentlemen, tell me, does this verse has to do anything with fantasy in this type of as a literary genre, especially being seen as something bad? So you tell me. Okay, Proverbs 12:11. Let's read the NIV. Those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies have no sense. And now ESV. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits, so this translation doesn't use fantasies, but explains deeper, worthless, so he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. For me, I already know the conclusion. Well, at least I think I know. I may be wrong, but I want to hear, just from you guys. Does this fantasy or worthless pursuit has to do anything with fantasy or fiction as a literary genre?
Absolutely not. I don't know who told you that, but I'll just put it this way: we're going to be held accountable for every time we take things out of, especially scripture, out of context like that. So that's going to be something he's going to have to answer to, and I certainly would want to. But that's not at all what that was talking about. Fantasies, delusions, what we were just talking about. That's what he's talking about. Don't be caught up in silly. And I actually, by the way, I got the ESV right over here too. I read it from the ESV. And I'm like, so when you first told me about that verse, I'm looking at it. I'm like, what is that? What, I don't get that. That's not talking about that at all. He's just talking about how don't waste your time. Pursue good things. Now, like we were talking about earlier, there's a time when like I used to do a long time ago, play video games for like 15 hours a day straight. That's a huge waste of time. That's an entire day just gone, and over nothing. And so I'll play a game. I don't play video games every single day. Usually it's like, if I do, it's towards the evening times where I'm just kind of winding down or something like that. I'll play like maybe like an hour or so before I get tired and I go to bed. But that's because that's like 1 hour in a day in which I'm doing a bunch of other stuff that needs to be done. I got editing stuff I gotta look over, and whatever. I got reading I gotta do, and I gotta, like, today I was going over and helping my parents over at their house, because they're out of town right now, so I'm helping them with the dogs and stuff. I had to do a little bit of grocery shopping. Those things had to be taken care of. Those are important things you got to do, and so uh, if you just waste your day doing nothing but playing video games, or just like Josh was saying, in delusions, and just sucked into those things, then it's a negative thing. That becomes a bad thing. That's what that text is talking about. It's not talking about fantasy stories. That's not. I mean, honestly, you seriously think that the author here had that in mind when he was writing this? When you read it in its context, that's not what he's talking about at all. He's just simply talking about don't waste your time on worthless pursuits. And that also could be things like a car that you really want, but ultimately is way too expensive and might, and your desire to have that car is interrupting your relationship with your wife or whatever, money on something like that when it should be spent on something more like for your family and stuff like that. So it's just something you just simply can't afford. That's a worthless pursuit, because that's something that just in the long run is total vanity. And that's really what that's talking about. So the idea that it's talking about, reading fantasy or playing video games is really silly. That's not what it's talking about at all. So
Yeah, I would agree. It's not just about not reading fiction, not just, but also it's not even against not playing fiction or not watching fiction. You said perfect. It's about vanity. So I can extend this easily, like you said, video games, or let's say watching movies or TV shows. It can be vanity, but it doesn't have to be vanity. Not every fantasy, watching, playing, reading is vanity. Like you said perfectly, can be maybe my I'm killing myself striving to be, I don't know, so ambitious at work that I neglect my family or church or whatever, or that maybe I'm trying to make some extra money by gambling. So I'm pursuing some fantasy that I think like God will help me win the lottery. Or it can be extended to anything that where we are becoming like fanatics of abusing something that shouldn't be abused. So in that way, we are chasing something that is not there. It's an illusion. It's a lie. So for me, novels, books, video games, movies, they don't belong in this passage just because they belong to the genre of fantasy. So I just wanted to extend on what you said. Yeah, Josh, what about you?
Well, we since we've said something about this, I don't I like to nerd out, and words are nerds, basically our tool. Let's say it's our weapon. So there's a reason why the scriptures, when interpreted in English, there's decisions to be made about which words are chosen for what purpose to translate what thing. And it just so happens that when you use the right resources that are available, you can find out why words were translated to be certain things. And there are resources that are available to us to ask those questions. And some of them are free. I can recommend people go online. Blueletterbible.org is a really easy website, super intuitive to use. And it's got interlinear translations that are available to you, that you can read the original language next to the translated phrase, and click on a particular word to find out what it means and why it was translated, what it was translated to, and
Study
even
Light as well. Study Light is another website.
yeah, that's a good one too. And they give you lists of where that word, like a concordance of where that word is in scripture also. The word that's translated as fantasies in that translation is actually vain or empty everywhere else it's ever translated. And people is what it's talking about, following vain persons, vain people, vain thinking. It's not necessarily even time wasting, as in leisure being a sin. It's actually talking about being led astray, or being, let's say, associated with the way that the beginning of the Psalms, blessed are those who are not sitting in the seat of these who are sinners and haters of God and so forth. It's when you are separate from those things. It's talking about not following people who are vain or empty. In Judges 9, I believe it is, Abimelech hires a vain or empty person, right? It's not, he what that guy wasn't fantasy. He was empty. He was vain. He was like these words mean something completely different than what we've been talking about in this episode. So it's not even remotely relevant to that verse.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Just quick concluding thoughts. What message do you have for our viewers, for both of those who like and dislike fantasy, especially about, do you think and do you agree with me or not, how Christians who love fantasy, they can use their passion as a tool when evangelizing or reaching out to other nerds who hate religion or don't go to church, don't want to do anything with God or the Bible and Christianity. Would you agree with me how our common passions and hobbies with those people can be used as a bridge slowly but surely through different means, different conversations, different topics, how we can one day help them point to Christ?
Uh, yeah. So my final thoughts would just be, um, like I was saying earlier, the Bible was written ultimately by the greatest storyteller ever. Storytellers. I mean, it's got everything in it. It's got plot twists. It's got the greatest plot twist of all time in the cross. Nobody saw that coming. It's got it's got love. It's got betrayal. It's got character arcs. It's got all that stuff. It's just the an absolutely incredible the greatest story ever, and it has the ultimate concept of ultimate reconciliation. And the fact that every single story, good story anyway, has that same element of reconciliation, of something being broken that needs to be fixed. Um, it demonstrates that this concept of reconciliation is in the minds of every single one of us, whether we're believers or not. This need to be reconciled, this need to find peace. And so we can show that in storytelling, because that's one of the ways we are all connected to one another, is we're all broken. And so storytelling is an excellent way to do that. Tell these great stories. If you got some kind of an idea, think about it, write it down, and you got to write it down. Remember what I was saying earlier, you got to just go for it and just write it down. And just to say that this is a great way to connect with unbelievers, to try and use, like what Jesus did with his parables. He uses parables to convey deep truths, also to get people to think about these things in another way, and to really just, I don't like to say simplify, but to really just make it more understandable for people, these deep spiritual truths. So that's what a lot of the parables are for. And we can use that same idea with storytelling to tell important truths in another way that, maybe people can connect with more easily. And so, yeah, that's just, for me, that's what I love about it. That's why I do it, to the glory of God. And hopefully that's through it, the Lord would use it to strengthen his people, but also bring into the fold more lost people, people who need to be reconciled, who need to find peace. That's what they ultimately need. I look at, I'm in some groups and stuff, and they make fun of, these uh, transgender people, and I look at them, and yeah, sometimes I'm angry, but ultimately I just look at these people. I'm like, this. I look at this guy, and I'm like, this guy needs help, man. I mean, he seriously needs help. And we kind of laugh at him, but I'm looking at this guy, and like, this is a guy who's broken. He's probably got some kind of trauma. Something happened to him when he was younger, and it's messed him up. And he's only been surrounded by people who just affirm this problem, this trauma. And he just dives deeper into it, and it just, more and more darkness needs to be reconciled. And so, that's that ultimate message of reconciliation, which is present in every great story. I want that. I want to be able to show that the Christian message has that. No other, you know, religious faith really does it, can give you that like Christianity does, so that's kind of the way I would say that.
So I guess since we're closing, to kind of condense down what we've said over the last 2 episodes we've been talking about this, is just that fiction and fantasy are not dirty words, and we can lose out by neglecting to receive some of the hard-earned wisdom of the past that's been preserved in story, that's been preserved in fiction, that's been preserved in mythology even, let alone being able to read the scriptures and know that that's the world that we live in, that's the true story, right? Like this is it's not, that's not fantasy, right? Like none of the three of us believe that the Bible is a fantasy. Jesus is alive. Like we mean that, right? Like, so it's not like the resurrection scenes you see in movies. We believe he's alive, and that's why we want to serve him. Like this, all of these things reflect back to us something that reminds us of the very truth. And that's why we love this so much. That's why we wanted to talk about this, why we wanted to do this, is because perhaps we can spur somebody who is, let's say, into fiction and fantasy to kind of think about how it can be of use to them, not just of entertainment to them, not just a cool hobby or just a quirky thing that you do with your friends on the weekend or whatever when you're having your D&D sessions. It's like you can really think about embodying and doing some of the things, being some of the characteristics, embodying those things that you receive from the stories that we're talking about. And it really does, like, it makes a difference to think about life and participate in life as though that were true, right? That as though the fact that you're in place A, you want to go to place B, the going in between is going to be the story, and you get to embody that. Like, it makes you more aware. It makes you more engaged. And oftentimes it can push your attention outward in a way that makes you less socially awkward in situations. It can give you an advantage because you're thinking ahead about situations, not through anxiety, but through anticipation. You start to build better expectations because you're thinking about what has happened to you in a way that's not just always going to be the question of why me in some real sense, And so I think that these things have a lot to offer, and people shouldn't miss out. And that's why we're so passionate about these things, is because we've been impacted by these kind of stories and these things to a point where we want what we experienced to be the privilege of someone else. And so I like being able to talk and do all that stuff, but I feel especially privileged to do it with you guys, because not only because I like you, I'm biased, I like you guys, but also because I have a lot of respect for the the desire to see other people see what you see, something like that, right? So I like that both of you guys are passionate about that, like I am, and I feel like I have like a feeling of brotherhood about it. So this has really been satisfying for me, and I'm very happy that this whole conversation ended up this way. It's I wouldn't have changed a bit.
He's saying he's very happy that I introduced you to.
Yes. Yeah. That's yep.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, brothers, it's been a pleasure. If I took more time than I was supposed to, I'm sorry for that. But I'm also glad for all the wisdom and nuggets that the viewers, once when when they watch these episodes, that they'll be hopefully digesting and thinking about everything we talked both last time and today. So I thank you once again for your time. I'm hoping you'll have wonderful and restful weekends. And we have to do this one more time. We'll make switch topics or something like this, but we have to continue because I find these topics very interesting and fascinating. And again, everything for the glory of God. So thank you once again, and God bless.